They say you don't really own the land, you're just borrowing it from time. But I disagreed. The moment I first set foot on the property, I knew I belonged to it as much as it belonged to me. The house was modest, tucked behind a grove of pine trees that whispered with the wind. But what made it mine, what made it me, was the lake behind it. A crescent-shaped body of water, calm deep and ringed by reeds and wildflowers. It wasn't listed as a selling point by the real estate agent, which I found shocking. Maybe because it was technically private land, the lake bordered only a handful of properties. But I knew from the title deed and from a deep dive into the county's historical plat maps that nearly half of the shoreline belonged to my lot. I was a retired environmental engineer. Not the tree-hugging activist type, but someone who'd spent 3 decades studying groundwater flow, soil absorption, and the unspoken language of ecosystems. So when I say that lake was alive, I don't mean it poetically. I mean it literally. It breathed with algae, cycles, pulsed with fish migrations, whispered secrets through the frogs at dusk. And it became my sanctuary. After losing my wife 5 years earlier to ovarian cancer, I had lived a quiet, structured life. The lake was where I found silence, not as a void, but as a balm. I would walk out every morning with a coffee and sit on the little dock I built with my own hands, watching the sun cast ripples across the surface. Her ashes were spread there near the willow tree, at the far end where dragonflies danced each summer. The neighborhood was called What Meadow Hills, though the lakeside part was a bit of a stretch for most residents. Only 5 houses backed up directly onto the lake mine, being one of them. The rest were arranged in neat little crescents, with manicured lawns, flagpoles, and mailboxes regulated by the Homeowners Association, or as everyone called them, the HOA. Now, I've never been hostile toward HOAs. I know they're supposed to preserve property values and ensure uniformity, but there's a difference between governance and control. And the Meadow Hills HOA, as I would learn, didn't recognize the line between the two. At first, it was the usual passive-aggressive nonsense warning letters about my native wildflowers looking unmanaged, or that my compost bin was visible from the road. I tolerated it more amused than annoyed. But what really drew a line in the sand, no in the mud, was what they did to the lake. It didn't happen all at once. It began with a subtle shift in the air. One morning, I stepped onto the dock and noticed a thin film clinging to the water's surface. It shimmered like oil, though not quite. A mix of yellow-gray sludge floated near the edge, sticking to the cattails. The smell was faint but sour, like wet concrete left to rot. I crouched down, dipping a mason jar just below the surface and sealing it tight. My training kicked in. I didn't panic, but my gut told me something foreign had entered the water. I walked the perimeter that day, following the shoreline through the neighboring lots. Most of them were empty mid-morning. One house, 3 lots down, had a patio overlooking the water. I noticed fresh tire tracks near the edge. Not from a car, but a large vehicle, something heavy with thick tread. The kind of tracks left by construction equipment. There had been a new landscaping project happening near the entrance to Meadow Hills, a community beautification initiative launched by the HOA. I remembered the flyer that came in the mail a month prior, plans for a new stone pathway and gazebo near the front gate. Expensive, overdone, but supposedly paid for through voluntary contributions. I didn't think much of it until the next morning when I saw something float past the dock. It was a broken tile, the kind used in patio installations, slate gray, still sharp at the edge. It drifted aimlessly, like a discarded thought. That night, I stayed up late, lights off, coffee in hand. I waited by the back window facing the lake. At 2:17 a.m., the sound came low, mechanical grunts, echoing from across the water. I pressed my face against the glass and squinted through the moonlight. 2 flatbed trucks, their lights dimmed, were parked just beyond the HOA-maintained greenbelt. Men in neon vests, without logos, were unloading mounds of rubble straight into the ravine that fed into the lake. Construction waste, dumped illegally. My hands shook, not with fear but fury. I didn't grab my phone right away. I wanted to be sure. I watched until they drove off, taillights blinking like warnings in the distance. Then I grabbed my camera and flashlight and headed out. The scene reeked of damp cement and plaster dust, broken drywall, rebar, shards of treated wood. It wasn't just debris. It was toxic waste for a living ecosystem like this lake. The next morning, I walked to the HOA office, a beige stucco building nestled near the community pool. The manager, a woman named Karen Holt, greeted me with the plastic smile of someone who had given too many citations for fence color. I showed her the pictures, the footage, the GPS-stamped video. I told her about the trucks, the sludge, the tile. I even handed her a printed page of the EPA regulation on illegal dumping in residential ecosystems. She looked at me, blinked twice, and said, "Are you accusing the HOA of criminal activity, Mr. Carson?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She continued firmer now. "If you continue spreading unfounded allegations, we will take appropriate action, including legal recourse." I left that office with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was cover-up. They thought I would be quiet. They thought I was just an old man clinging to a pond, but they didn't know who I used to be. They didn't know what I'd seen. Chemical runoff, disasters, groundwater poisons that led to birth defects in factory towns. Government officials who ignored scientists until it was too late. I'd fought companies 10 times bigger than this HOA, and I didn't lose those fights. I walked home past the homes with perfect lawns and plastic eagles perched on mailboxes, and I whispered to myself just once as I stepped onto my dock again, "You dumped into the wrong lake." The lake had always smelled of pine needles mud and something faintly sweet that reminded me of honeysuckle. But the morning after my confrontation with Karen Holt, I stepped out onto the dock and was met with a stench that stopped me cold. It hit like a wave, sharp, acrid, and unnatural. I coughed and instinctively covered my nose, squinting at the lake's surface. A strange yellow-gray slick hugged the shoreline. It didn't swirl like normal algae or pollen. It clung, thick, greasy, and alive in a sickly way. The sun caught the sheen just right, and I could see iridescent swirls, traces of chemicals not meant for water. I grabbed my camera again. This time, I zoomed in. There were things floating, bits of insulation, fragments of PVC pipe plastic wrapping with barcodes still visible. I panned left, and something caught my eye, 3 dead fish bobbing belly up near the reeds. One was a bass, the kind that usually lurked deep. For it to rise and die here meant the oxygen levels had plummeted. Fast. My heart ached as I crouched to scoop another water sample. It was warm. Too warm. And it left a residue on my fingers. The damage had started. I spent the next hour walking the edge of my property with gloves on, picking up what I could, sharp bits of concrete, broken ceramic tiles, a rusted nail poking from a chunk of drywall. I used an old metal bucket to collect the debris, but by the time I was done, it was nearly full. That afternoon, I sent an email to the HOA board. Short, polite, professional. Subject: environmental concern. Lake contamination evidence. Dear HOA board, following up on yesterday's visit to your office, I am attaching updated photos and videos showing clear signs of construction waste contamination in the lake behind my property. The environmental impact is immediate and measurable. As a retired environmental engineer, I am deeply concerned not just for the property value, but for the safety of local wildlife and residents. Please acknowledge receipt of this message and advise of the immediate corrective actions being taken. Sincerely, Thomas Carson, Lot, number 12, Meadow Hills. I didn't expect an answer, but I did expect decency. Instead, what I got was a thin envelope in my mailbox 2 days later. Were cease and desist. Typed in bold across the top from a law firm I'd never heard of. It accused me of making defamatory claims of inciting unrest in the community and warned of escalating consequences should the behavior continue. It was surreal getting threatened for defending a lake, for exposing a truth that didn't care about policy or reputation. But they underestimated 2 things: my patience and my network. After retirement, I'd kept up with colleagues from my consulting years. Some had gone into academia, others into policy. One of them, Maria Collins, now worked for the State Environmental Protection Commission under the Department of Natural Resources. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but I still had her number saved. I hesitated for a moment, then hit dial. "Tom," she said when she picked up. "Is that you?" "It's me," I said, voice low. "I've got a situation." Within the hour, I had forwarded her everything. Photos, videos, sample logs, timestamps, vehicle IDs. Maria promised to loop in a contact in field enforcement, but she warned me gently, HOAs are murky. They don't fall under state jurisdiction easily. You'll need more harder evidence. Impact on public health, possible waterway connection. I thanked her and hung up. I knew what I had to do next. That night, I rented a drone. I wasn't interested in vague claims anymore. I wanted visual proof of where the trucks were entering, where they were dumping, and what route they were taking to get there. I programmed the drone for low-level patrol along the tree line behind the lake and waited. At 3:12 a.m., the drone's motion sensor kicked in. I watched from my laptop screen as two trucks this time, unmarked, entirely pulled into the same clearing. Under cover of darkness, with only red rear lights, they backed up slowly and dumped several loads of broken bricks, plasterboard, and bags of something gray and heavy into the soil. The drone zoomed in just enough to catch a face. I didn't recognize him, but someone would. I clipped the footage and uploaded it to a private Google Drive folder. Then I filed an anonymous tip to the county environmental hotline. The next morning, the HOA newsletter arrived in every mailbox. Community update. Online disinformation campaign. It has come to our attention that certain individuals are spreading harmful, unfounded rumors about the HOA's environmental practices. We assure you that all activities are in accordance with municipal codes and overseen by licensed contractors. We ask for your support in keeping Meadow Hills a respectful and harmonious neighborhood. They didn't name me, but they didn't have to. Neighbors began pulling their kids away when I walked past. Some waved awkwardly. One woman whispered thank you as she watered her roses. Another muttered troublemaker just loud enough to reach my ears. I didn't respond. I just returned home, sat on my dock again, and stared at the lake. The slick was spreading. It no longer clung to the shore, but reached inward like rot in a piece of fruit. That evening, I saw something that turned my concern into outright fury. A family of ducks, ones I'd seen grow from hatchlings last spring, swam toward the middle of the lake. The mother duck paused, circling her ducklings, and suddenly jerked violently, flapping her wings in distress. Within seconds, she collapsed sideways. The ducklings scattered. She floated there motionless. I ran into the water, wading in knee-deep, ignoring the sting on my skin. I scooped her up with my hands, heart-pounding, chest tight. Her eyes were cloudy. She wasn't breathing. That night, I wrapped her in cloth and placed her in a cooler with dry ice. Then I drove an hour out to the Hall State Wildlife Health Lab and submitted her body for analysis. The woman at the front desk raised her brows when I explained. "You think chemical runoff killed her?" "I don't think," I said quietly. "I know." She nodded and handed me a receipt. I walked out of that lab, not as a man filing a complaint, but as a man building a case. And I wasn't building it alone. Maria called the next day. "Tom, your drone footage is gold." The plate numbers led to a contractor with a suspended license in another county. My contacts elevating this beyond just local jurisdiction. "Meaning," I asked. "Meaning someone higher up wants to look at this. Fast." There was a pause. "And by higher up, I mean, the governor's office just requested your footage." I sat back, staring at the lake through the window. It was still silent, like it was waiting for justice. So was I. The lake was no longer just a part of my home. It had become a crime scene, a battleground, and a quiet witness to deceit. But unlike me, it couldn't speak. It could only show its pain through poisoned fish, dying ducks, and the unnatural stench that still hung in the morning air. And if no one was going to fight for it, I would. I spent the next few nights documenting. I slept in shifts 3 hours at a time, then positioned myself by the window overlooking the tree line. The HOA greenbelt that wrapped behind our homes was meant to be a buffer zone, a little sliver of wild nature for birds, squirrels, and residents to enjoy on their walks. But now, under moonlight, it had become a covert dumping route. I set up motion-triggered lights hidden in the underbrush. The drone remained charged and ready beside my desk. Every battery I had, every SD card, was loaded. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Then one night at exactly 1:43 a.m., it happened again. My external sensors tripped, and the monitor flickered to life. 2 large trucks lumbered down the gravel path behind the HOA maintenance shed. I switched to the drone feed. This time, they were moving faster, maybe nervous after the tip had been submitted. The men were in hooded jackets, moving with deliberate haste. No reflective vests this time. They seemed more careful, more secretive. But they hadn't counted on me having thermal vision set up. The heat signatures glowed like ghosts on my screen. 4 men total. 1 by the truck, 2 unloading, 1 near the edge of the water. He carried what looked like a long tube and positioned it near the runoff ditch that fed directly into the lake from the lot above. Then he stepped back as a low sludgy flow oozed down the channel. They weren't just dumping, they'd rigged a chute, a permanent one. I hit record and zoomed in. The runoff was viscous, darker than before, mixed with ash or powdered cement. The kind of sludge that settles, suffocates, and seeps into the groundwater. My skin crawled. I whispered to the air, "Gotcha." When the trucks rolled out 15 minutes later, I caught a clear shot of the license plates. One was from a landscaping company registered in a neighboring city. One I remembered had been shut down 2 years ago for code violations. That alone was damning, but I needed more. So I left the footage running and pulled up the company's information. Suspended license, no EPA permit, no solid waste disposal authorization. Perfect! The next day, I created a formal incident report using the state's environmental database, detailed with GPS coordinates, timestamps, and video evidence. I attached everything to a drive I had named simply Lake Case, Phase 3, Miss Also. But I wasn't finished. I drove downtown to the county clerk's office. On a hunch, I requested copies of all HOA construction project filings for the last 18 months. The woman at the counter gave me a polite but puzzled look. "This isn't a public record request we get every day," she said. "I'm not an everyday guy," I replied. When the documents arrived, I flipped through them carefully. Most were boilerplate maintenance permits, trim trees, repair fences, repaint sidewalks. But one entry stood out. HOA landscaping renovation, lot expansion, path clearing greenbelt. Filed under an expedited category. No environmental impact report, no public notice, no contractor name. That was illegal. Even the smallest soil disturbance, within 50 feet of a natural water source, required a HE site assessment and EPA consultation. This had none. Worse, it had a signature one I recognized. Karen Holt. Now I had her not just morally, but legally. Later that week, Maria called me again, her voice more urgent than before. "Tom, I hope you're sitting down." I was. "The governor's office just flagged your footage. And apparently, the governor's nephew who works at the state EPA recognized the dumping site from a weekend hiking trip near your area. He took photos of the same trucks, but didn't know where to report them." I blinked. "You're telling me this is already known to the governor's own family?" "Yes, and now it's personal." I felt something shift in me. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It was gaining traction at the highest level. And then, almost poetically, my mailbox coughed up another letter that afternoon. This one was thick, embossed with a golden HOA seal. Inside it read, "Notice of Non-Compliance. Violation of Community Cooperation Clause. Dear Mr. Carson, your continued use of unauthorized surveillance equipment and dissemination of confidential community images constitute a breach of HOA bylaw 4.13b Section C. Failure to remove all recording equipment and cease defamatory statements will result in daily fines and potential lien placement. Respectfully, Meadow Hills HOA Enforcement Office." They were threatening to fine me for documenting crimes. I let out a bitter laugh. They were grasping, panicking. They didn't realize the net was already tightening. That evening, I walked the perimeter again, clipboard in hand, as though I were just an old man taking notes. But inside, I was raging. The lake was dying. The frogs no longer sang at night. The herons that once waited silently near the eastern shore were gone. And the smell, that god-awful synthetic sourness, hung in the air even when the wind shifted. I received the necropsy results from the wildlife lab via email that night. Toxicity confirmed. Neurological damage consistent with petroleum-based compounds and concrete lime exposure. In other words, the mother duck had suffocated from chemicals leached into the lake. I forwarded the report to Maria and copied her EPA contact. Within hours, my phone rang again. "This is escalating," she said. "Fast. The governor's office wants to meet privately. You'll get a call within 48 hours. "Will it help?" I asked. Her voice was firm. "If they show up, Tom, it's game over for your HOA. I closed my laptop and looked out the window once more. The night was quiet again. But the lake wasn't sleeping, and neither was I. 2 days later, the call came. I was sitting on the back porch with my usual cup of black coffee, the lake still coated in that faint chemical shimmer, when my phone buzzed with a restricted number. I let it ring twice before answering, my pulse already steady, already bracing. Mr. Carson, the voice asked. Male, mid-30s, clipped and professional.
Yes.
This is Charles Reeve. I'm an environmental advisor to Governor Maxwell's office. We've reviewed the materials you submitted via Ms. Collins and the EPA. The governor would like to arrange a site visit within the week off the record for now. Can you accommodate? I looked out across the water. The reflection of the rising sun glinted off the greasy slick like a wound that refused to heal.
I can.
Good. You'll receive a secure email with the details. Please keep this confidential until the visit concludes.
I will.
He paused before hanging up. For what it's worth, Mr. Carson, that lake reminds me of where I learned to fish as a boy. Let's try to save it. I hung up without a word. There was nothing left to say. The wheels were turning. What came next was a masterclass in damage control on the part of the HOA. Karen Holt must have caught wind that something was shifting. The tone of the neighborhood newsletter changed almost overnight. Instead of passive-aggressive notices about grass length or unauthorized solar lights, it was now filled with community unity messages. Meadow Hills is more than a neighborhood, it's a family. We must stand strong against misinformation. Together, we protect what makes our home beautiful. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if it hadn't been so sinister. They didn't stop at newsletters. On Wednesday morning, I received a visit from two board members I'd never interacted with before. A man in his 50s named Greg, former insurance adjuster, always wore khakis, and a younger woman named Celeste, who introduced herself as the new community outreach liaison. They knocked on my door holding a gift basket. Just dropping by to check in, Greg said, smile stretched tight. You know, there's been a lot of chatter lately, and we'd really prefer to clear the air face-to-face rather than let rumors spiral. I stepped outside but didn't invite them in. Rumors. Celeste nodded too eagerly. Yes, there's been some concern that inaccurate reports might be causing unnecessary panic. We're just trying to make sure everyone's on the same page. Which page is that, I asked? The one where your trucks dump cement slurry into protected waters. Their smiles faltered. Greg stepped forward, slightly lowering his voice. Mr. Carson, let's not escalate this. We understand you're passionate about the lake. We all are. But if you continue to act unilaterally, recording footage, contacting agencies, you leave us no choice but to consider further disciplinary measures. I tilted my head, such as, he hesitated. We've spoken with legal counsel, fines, potential civil suits, a lien if necessary. And if I spoke with the governor, I said casually. They froze. Celeste blinked. I'm sorry. I leaned in just enough for them to hear my voice calm. You're trespassing now. I suggest you leave. The gift basket thudded softly on the porch as they turned and walked away without another word. I left it there to rot. By Friday, subtle retaliation began. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked off its post twice. A complaint was filed about my yard clutter, citing my rain barrels and garden tools, which had been there for years without issue. HOA patrol cars parked outside my home for extended periods, engine idling, lights off. But I kept quiet. I was building momentum, not noise. And then the governor arrived. Not in a motorcade. Not with press. Just a black SUV, 3 passengers. One was Charles Reeve. Another I recognized from a press conference on environmental justice, a woman named Lydia Hahn, deputy director of the State Environmental Board. And the third was Governor Alan Maxwell himself, dressed in hiking boots and a canvas jacket. He stepped out, shook my hand with quiet gravity, and said, "Let's walk." We traced the path behind the HOA greenbelt. I pointed out the dumping site, showed them the crude chute now hidden under brush. I handed over water sample logs, photos, the necropsy report on the duck, and the drone footage on a thumb drive. Reeve asked sharp questions. Lydia took notes. Maxwell listened. After nearly an hour, we ended up on the dock behind my house. He knelt by the edge and dipped his hand into the water. When he stood, his fingers were coated in that faint gray residue. "Reminds me of Pine Hollow, 1993, he said quietly. I blinked. Pine Hollow was a disaster-contaminated runoff from an illegal construction site, had poisoned groundwater, and caused congenital defects in nearby children. It had taken years to clean up, and even longer to gain public trust again. You were part of that, I asked. He nodded. Fresh out of law school, that case changed me. He turned to face me squarely. We'll take it from here. But stay alert. These things, they get ugly before they get better. He wasn't wrong. 3 days after the visit, the HOA called for an emergency, closed-door board meeting. Residents weren't invited. The windows were covered. Karen Holt didn't show. 2 days later, an anonymous tip appeared on the neighborhood's private online forum. The HOA used funds from our emergency reserve to pay an unlicensed contractor for illegal waste removal. Several board members knew. One signed the expedited permit. They're trying to bury it all. Comments exploded. Neighbors demanded answers. Some apologized to me via private message. Others, like the man who called me a troublemaker, now wanted to organize a Save the Lake committee. The facade was cracking. Then came the official notice from the governor's office. Pending environmental review, the HOA Board of Meadow Hills is under investigation for illegal dumping, environmental negligence, and misuse of community funds. And finally, mercifully, the trucks stopped coming. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I'd heard in weeks, but I knew it wasn't over. By the end of the week, the Meadow Hills community was unraveling. Residents who had once ignored me, or worse, accused me of stirring up trouble, were now tiptoeing past my house with side glances and hushed tones. The online forum was in full revolt. Posts ranged from mild concern to outright rage, especially after the governor's notice had gone public. The HOA tried to spin it, of course. A new bulletin landed on every doorstep in goldenrod-colored envelopes that screamed urgency. Community clarification. Misinformation alert. We acknowledge recent concerns regarding construction management and greenbelt usage. Rest assured, all actions taken were in the interest of long-term property enhancement and beautification. The HOA board is cooperating fully with state inquiries and will continue to uphold our community values. I didn't know whether to laugh or spit. Beautification, they called it. Try telling that to the dead heron I found near my dock 2 nights prior. Its legs tangled in murky reeds, wings slick with grime. But I wasn't just waiting anymore. I wanted to know who signed what, who authorized what, and who had profited. So I called a favor. Sam Whitaker was a quiet genius who had once audited corporate environmental compliance reports for the Department of Justice. We'd worked together on a case in 2004 involving an illegal battery disposal site in Nevada. Sam had since retired to Florida and mostly fished for marlin, but he owed me one, and he never forgot a ledger. I need to trace money, I told him over the phone. That's my love language, he replied. I sent over scans of the HOA's publicly filed expense reports for the last 2 years available through the county clerk's office. On the surface, the documents were dry and generic. Landscaping fees, facility maintenance, community improvement projects, all the right words. But Sam's reply came 3 hours later with a single sentence. You've got a shell game here. He broke it down in bullets. 1. The HOA had filed for $63,000 in greenbelt improvement over a 6-month period. 2. The payments went to Salto Lakeside Earthworks, LLC, a company that didn't show up in any contractor licensing database. 3. The registered address for Lakeside Earthworks traced back to a UPS store in the next town over. 4. The mailing contact was Trevor Holt, Karen Holt's son. A chill rolled down my spine. I remembered him vaguely. Tall-shaved head, drove a lifted truck. He'd shown up at one HOA meeting when they were voting on paint colors for fences and hadn't said a word. Apparently, he didn't need to. Karen had signed off on paying her son's fake company nearly $70,000 to illegally dump construction waste into a protected lake, funded by our community fee. It was embezzlement, it was fraud, it was criminal, and it was time to make it public. I compiled the data into a single report: payments, shell company address, business license absence, drone footage, toxicity reports, and the dead wildlife documentation. I titled it Meadow Hills, a case of environmental abuse and financial fraud by HOA leadership. I printed 5 copies and sent one to the governor's office, the EPA regional field office, the county district attorney, the local news channel's investigative team, and just for poetic justice, the Meadow Hills HOA mailbox. The final copy I kept for myself, locked in my safe. The next morning, the dam broke. I woke to the sound of tires crunching gravel. I pulled back the curtain and saw 2 black SUVs. Not the governor's team this time, but county vehicles. One bore the seal of the Environmental Enforcement Division. The other, the district attorney's office. They weren't here for tea. I watched from my window as two men in suits and a woman in khakis walked straight to the HOA office building. They knocked once. The door opened slowly. Karen Holt stood in the doorway, pale and tight-lipped. I couldn't hear what was said, but I could see the moment her composure cracked. She stepped back. One of the men handed her a document, subpoena probably. The woman spoke sharply and pointed toward the office. Karen didn't argue. She stepped aside. By noon, 3 more cars arrived, this time reporters. Channel 4 News had already posted a headline online. HOA under fire for illegal dumping, alleged fraud governor's office involved. And just like that, Meadow Hills transformed. Neighbors stopped avoiding me. Some came to my door with timid thank yous. Others handed me copies of HOA complaints they'd previously been too afraid to file about shady charges, disappearing repair budgets, and Karen's selective enforcement of rules. One woman, Margie Flores from Lot 27, wept as she handed me a letter. She fined us $500 for putting in a wheelchair ramp for my husband, she said. Said it wasn't pre-approved. I've been ashamed of how we stayed silent when we heard what you were doing. I took her hand. You don't need to be ashamed. You're speaking now. That night, the air felt different. It carried the faint scent of fresh rain and mud, but not the acrid chemical kind. The natural kind. The one I hadn't smelled in weeks. I sat on my dock as the sun dipped low, a breeze rippling across the lake. It was still sick, but it was breathing again. I could feel it. Then my phone buzzed with a message from Maria. EPA enforcement team scheduled for next week. Reinstating water monitoring buoys. State soil remediation grant is in progress. Governor says you've done more than most departments combined. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I just wanted to protect what mattered. Her reply came instantly. And you did. Now let's finish it. I leaned back, exhaling long and slow, letting the air fill my lungs. This wasn't over. Not yet. But the lies had been dragged into the light, and light has a way of healing things. It started with a shimmer, just a subtle change, in the way the sunlight bounced off the lake. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning. The water, usually a deep blue-gray this time of year, looked greener. Not in a healthy, life-filled way, but in that artificial neon hue that didn't belong in nature. The kind of green that screams something is wrong. I'd seen it before, years ago on a consulting job at an industrial park in Missouri, where fertilizer runoff turned a healthy creek into a toxic channel. That same eerie glow had spread across the surface just days before the fish began dying in droves. I stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the dock, my boots crunching the still damp grass. The moment I reached the edge, the smell hit me. Rotting algae, decaying fish, a chemical undertone like burnt plastic and chlorine mixed in a stew of death. The green had spread. What began as a thin film near the northern bank had now consumed almost half the lake. The water's surface moved sluggishly, like it had grown thicker, heavier. And then, I saw them. Dozens of small fish, minnows, bluegill, even a young catfish, all dead. Their pale underbellies reflected the morning sun as they floated to the surface in clusters, some tangled in slimy green strands of algae. I turned away and gritted my teeth, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't just illegal dumping, this was ecosystem collapse. I grabbed my notebook, the one I'd used to log every observation since this started, and scribbled the date, time, temperature, wind direction. Then I took more samples: water, algae, dead fish. I packed them into coolers and called the EPA team Maria had said would be arriving soon. They bumped the visit forward by 2 days. That evening, my neighbor David from Lot 8 knocked on my door. He was the quiet type, former high school principal, retired early after his wife passed away. We'd exchanged pleasantries over the years, but never had a real conversation. I saw the lake this morning, he said. His voice shook slightly. My grandson played in it just last week. Now he has a rash, arms, legs. Even his eyes are red. I led him inside and showed him the footage, the lab results, the toxicology reports. As he flipped through the pages, his face turned pale. I can't believe this, he whispered. We trusted them. Trust, I said, is the first thing they took from us. That night, 3 more neighbors messaged me. One had a dog who'd started vomiting after jumping into the water. Another's garden, watered from a lake-fed pump, had wilted in just 4 days. A third had screenshots of HOA board members quietly deactivating their social media profiles. The panic was building, and the green was spreading. The EPA team arrived on Thursday, 3 unmarked trucks and a flatbed trailer carrying equipment that looked like it belonged to a sci-fi movie set. 2 technicians immediately started taking soil core samples, while another team deployed 3 floating buoys across the lake, each equipped with pH sensors, oxygen readers, and real-time chemical analyzers. I stood beside Lydia Hahn, the EPA deputy, as she reviewed the preliminary numbers on a tablet. Her expression darkened. "Tom, these levels." She trailed off, zooming in on the graphs. "This isn't just surface contamination, it's systemic. We're seeing signs of nitrogen surges, phosphates, cement residue, even trace benzene derivatives." "Benzene," I echoed. "That's carcinogenic." "Yep." She turned to me. "We're filing for emergency environmental remediation, and we'll be issuing a cease and desist on any HOA-authorized construction until this is resolved. Possibly criminal charges depending on what the DA uncovers." At that moment, a faint shout came from the opposite bank. One of the field techs was waving frantically, pointing to something tangled near the shallow edge. We jogged over to find a deer, young, maybe a year old, lying half submerged in the water. Its legs twitched weakly, foam bubbling at the corners of its mouth. Its breathing was labored, eyes glazed. The tech knelt down, checked its vitals, then looked up. "Too late." I turned away, jaw-tight, fists clenched. The lake was killing everything it touched, and the HOA still hadn't said a word. The community meeting that evening was packed. For the first time since the HOA formed the clubhouse, was standing room only. Every neighbor who had once shrugged off the whispers or laughed at the crazy lake guy now sat with faces pale and arms crossed. Karen Holt didn't show. Greg, the smug board member who once warned me to stay silent, stepped up to the podium. "There have been concerns." He began fidgeting with his notes. "We are aware of the situation and are cooperating with all authorities." The crowd murmured, an angry rising buzz. "You lied to us," someone called out. "My daughter got sick," another yelled. "You paid your son to dump trash," a woman screamed, pointing toward the stage. Greg tried to speak again, but his voice drowned beneath the outrage. Celeste, the so-called community liaison, stood beside him, face pale and blank. Then a new voice cut through the din. It was David, my quiet neighbor from Lot 8. He stood holding up a photo of his grandson's rash-covered arms. "This," he said, "voice firm, is what your greenbelt beautification did to my family." Silence swept the room like a wave. I took that moment to step forward. I wasn't scheduled to speak, but no one stopped me. "My name is Tom Carson," I said into the mic. "Most of you know me, or at least you thought you did. I'm the guy with the rain barrels. The guy who kept walking the lake every morning. The guy who kept sending emails no one answered." I let that sink in. What you may not know is that I spent 30 years studying environmental engineering. I've testified in courtrooms, taught at universities, and helped clean up some of the worst industrial sites in the country. And I'm telling you now, our lake isn't just polluted, it's dying. I held up a bag with a sample of the green sludge. This came from the same water your children have played in. The same water that seeps into our soil, our plants, and eventually our bodies. I looked directly at Greg, then at the crowd. And it didn't get this way overnight. It got this way because the people we trusted to protect our community chose profit over responsibility. They signed contracts with fake companies. They bypassed environmental codes. They used our money to poison our homes. Someone stood and clapped, then another, and another. Soon the entire clubhouse thundered with applause. Not for me, really. For the truth, for justice, for a long overdue reckoning. The board adjourned the meeting without another word. That night, as I walked home under a darkening sky, a neighbor approached and quietly handed me a manila folder. Inside were printed emails, copies of internal HOA correspondence. One dated months ago read, "If Carson keeps poking around, we'll hit him with a lien and bleed him out in court." Signed by Karen Holt. They had planned to destroy me, but they forgot something vital. I wasn't just protecting property. I was protecting legacy. I stood by the lake again that night beneath the stars as frogs began to croak for the first time in days. The water was still poisoned, but hope was returning. I was halfway through logging new water sample readings when the phone rang. It was Maria again, though this time her voice was tighter, faster. "Tom," she said without preamble, "you need to sit down." I didn't. I just gripped the phone harder. "There's been movement at the state level," she continued. "The governor's office isn't just reviewing your case anymore. They're initiating a formal investigation into HOA corruption. And it's not just yours." That made me pause. What do you mean? I mean, she said Meadow Hills is only the tip of the iceberg. Your evidence has opened a floodgate. There are at least 5 other communities with similar dumping complaints, same shell companies, same playbook, same players, all tied together through one name, Trevor Holt. I felt my spine straighten. Karen's son. Yes, and that's not all. The contractor he listed as supervisor on those fake invoices, he's currently under federal probation for illegal waste transport in Kentucky. He's not even supposed to be operating in this state. My blood ran cold. I had expected fraud, maybe even some reckless negligence, but this was organized abuse, repeated and scaled. Maria continued, her voice now shifting into something colder, more procedural. The governor is requesting a special review under the Environmental Racketeering Act. That would make it a felony case. Is that why the truck stopped? I asked. No, she said grimly. They stopped because someone warned them, which brings me to the real reason I'm calling. There was a pause. I could hear her flipping pages on the other end. You're being watched, Tom. One of our field agents spotted an unmarked SUV parked near your property 3 nights in a row. No state plates, no agency ID. We believe someone maybe from the Holt Circle is trying to intimidate you. My hand clenched into a fist on the kitchen counter. I'm not scared, I said. I know, she replied. But be smart. We're assigning a security liaison to your case. Discreet, former forest ranger turned investigator. She'll be in touch. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I appreciate it. Before hanging up, she said, You started something much bigger than a lake, Tom. You've exposed a network. After the call ended, I stood in silence. The kitchen hummed with the quiet rhythm of my old fridge. Outside, a breeze danced across the lake, rippling the water like a nervous breath. I had wanted justice for a pond. Now I was standing at the mouth of a statewide scandal. Later that afternoon, the sky grew heavy. Rain wasn't scheduled, but the clouds didn't care. They rolled in thick and gray, and soon a misty drizzle began to fall. I took it as a cue and pulled on my jacket, heading down to the lake to check the buoy readings. One of them had blinked offline during the night, and I wanted to inspect it manually. Halfway down the path, I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it might be one of the EPA techs doing an unscheduled check. But when I turned, I found myself face to face with a man I'd never seen before. Broad shoulders, gray cargo vest, clean-cut beard, eyes sharp and unreadable. He didn't smile, just held out a laminated badge. Marla Sanderson, State Environmental Enforcement, Special Liaison. Okay, not a man. Ranger Sanderson, she said, her voice low and clipped. Call me Marla. Maria briefed me. I'll be shadowing you discreetly. You won't know I'm there most of the time, but if anyone comes close to your property line again, I'll know before they knock. I was stunned but grateful. That fast, huh? She nodded. Let's just say you've made powerful people nervous. Nervous people do stupid things. We walked the shoreline together. Marla didn't say much, but when she did, it was direct, tactical. Trevor Holt was seen 2 counties over, meeting with someone from a demolition firm that was fined for burying asbestos in 2020. She said, We think he's looking to tie up loose ends. You're a loose end. I chuckled darkly. I'm not easy to cut. She smiled for the first time. That's what they're starting to realize. When we reached the offline buoy, she helped me pull it from the water. The casing had been tampered with, scraped open by what looked like a flathead screwdriver. Someone had tried to disable the sensor. Sabotage. Marla photographed the damage and called it in immediately. She didn't panic. She documented, measured, logged. A professional. As she worked, I looked out at the lake. The rain had intensified slightly, dimpling the surface in thousands of tiny craters. The green tint had lightened, washed into streaks like ink diluted with water. It was ugly, but it was moving, changing, healing. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I invited someone over. David and his grandson Ethan came by around 6 p.m., carrying a homemade casserole and a thank you card. Ethan wanted to say something, David said, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. Ethan looked up at me shyly, scratching the rash on his elbow. Thank you for saving the lake, he whispered. I knelt to his level eyes, meeting his. I didn't save it yet, I said, but I'm trying. He nodded solemnly, then handed me a drawing he'd made crayons on printer paper. It showed a smiling version of me standing beside a sparkling blue lake, birds flying overhead, and frogs jumping on lily pads. At the top, in big shaky letters, he'd written, Mr. Carson is a lake hero. I swallowed hard. The casserole was good, but that drawing stayed with me longer. The next day, news broke that Karen Holt had stepped down from her position as HOA president. The announcement came via a cold 3-sentence email. Effective immediately, Karen Holt has resigned from the Meadow Hills HOA board. We thank her for her years of service. Interim leadership will be announced shortly. No apology, no accountability, just quiet exit. But the silence wouldn't save her. The DA had issued a subpoena for her financial records. Trevor Holt had reportedly lawyered up. And the governor's office scheduled a press conference for the following Monday, one that Maria told me would feature Meadow Hills as an example of environmental reckoning. I stood on the porch that night with a glass of water in my hand. Not wine. Water. Tap. Cold. Clear. I stared at it for a long time before sipping. You don't think about water much until it betrays you, or until you betray it. The lake still had weeks, maybe months, before it would be safe again. The remediation process was slow. The soil would need rebalancing. The fish repopulated. The toxic sludge removed layer by painful layer. But now it had a chance, and so did we. The press conference was held on a bright Monday morning in front of the Meadow Hills Community Center. What used to be a symbol of HOA authority, with its beige stone columns and perfectly trimmed hedges, was now a backdrop for something far bigger than anyone in our quiet suburban bubble had expected. There were cameras, reporters, boom mics, and a podium adorned with the state seal. A small crowd of residents gathered on the grass, some still in lawn chairs from their Sunday barbecues, others standing with arms crossed and guarded eyes. It felt like the whole state had turned its attention to our little lake. And at the center of it all stood Governor Alan Maxwell, flanked by Maria Collins, Lydia Hahn from the EPA, and a representative from the district attorney's office. I stood off to the side, not part of the official lineup. But when the governor's eyes found me across the crowd, he gave the slightest nod. He hadn't forgotten. He stepped up to the podium and leaned toward the microphone. "Good morning," he began. "Meadow Hills is not just a community. It is now the epicenter of a broader environmental and legal crisis that has echoed across this state." The crowd stirred. Cameras clicked like insects. Over the past several months, evidence has surfaced revealing illegal dumping of construction waste into privately owned waterways, most notably the lake behind Mr. Thomas Carson's home. He turned briefly in my direction, and all eyes followed. My chest tightened. Thanks to Mr. Carson's vigilance and his unshakable commitment to environmental stewardship, we have uncovered a network of fraud, negligence, and corporate malfeasance affecting multiple communities throughout the region. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several neighbors turned to look at each other, some shocked, some ashamed. Maxwell continued. "Today I am announcing the launch of a statewide environmental accountability task force, with expanded enforcement powers, a direct hotline for citizen reports, and a new grant initiative to fund local remediation projects." More applause now, real applause. "And let me be clear," he said, his voice lowering firm. "Any individual or entity, HOA contractor, or otherwise found to be complicit in environmental abuse will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Cameras flashed again. Reporters jostled forward, shouting questions. What about the HOA president? Will there be criminal charges? How many communities are involved? Can residents sue the HOA? Maxwell raised a hand to calm the crowd. All of those answers will come. But first, let me say this. None of this would have been possible without the courage of a single homeowner who refused to look the other way. My heart stilled. "Mr. Carson, would you join me?" I hadn't expected that. I told Maria I wanted no part of the spotlight. But now, with dozens of people staring, something inside me shifted. Not ego, not pride, just responsibility. I stepped forward slowly, the concrete walkway stretching long beneath my feet. As I reached the podium, Maxwell extended his hand and pulled me beside him. "Would you like to say a few words?" I looked out at the crowd, at David and little Ethan, at Marla, standing at the perimeter, arms crossed like a sentinel, at the faces that had once dismissed me now listening. I took a breath. "My name is Tom Carson," I began, voice steady, "and I didn't plan to be here." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. "I bought a home. I loved a lake. That was it. I watched ducks raise their young in the reeds. I watched the fog roll across the surface each morning like a promise. I didn't think I'd have to defend it from the people who were supposed to protect it. I paused. But I learned something sometimes. The people in charge don't do the right thing. And when that happens, it's up to us, the ordinary neighbors, the so-called troublemakers, to stand up and say no. A swell of clapping rose again. This lake doesn't belong to me. It belongs to all of us, our children, our future. And it's not too late to save it. I stepped back. Maxwell smiled and leaned to the mic one last time. That's the spirit we need more of. Thank you, Tom. After the conference, the media stayed behind to grab their sound bites, but I slipped away toward the lake. I needed air, space, silence. But I wasn't alone for long. Lydia Hahn caught up with me by the shoreline. She held a manila envelope and handed it over. This is for you, she said. Official confirmation your lake has been accepted into the Chang State Conservation Stewardship Program. Full funding, long-term monitoring, restoration support. I opened it. The papers were dense with bureaucratic language, but one sentence jumped out. Primary guardian Thomas Carson's. I didn't apply for this, I said. No, she replied, but you earned it. We stood for a moment watching as the sun caught the water in patches of shifting light. The surface, while still tinged with residue, was beginning to breathe again. You'll get fish back, she said, in time. I nodded, emotion tightening my throat. Then a voice behind us called out, David and Ethan. Look, the boy yelled, pointing to a patch of reeds. And there it was. A single frog, small and bright green, perched on a damp rock, croaking once before disappearing beneath the water. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with a cold beer in one hand and the drawing Ethan had given me in the other. I had framed it right above my fireplace where it would stay. Mr. Carson is a lake hero. I'd never wanted to be a hero. Still didn't. I just wanted things to be right. For the lake to be safe again. For neighbors to care more about each other than about matching fences. The HOA building was now padlocked. A forensic accounting team had moved in, boxes of files stacked like fallen dominoes. Karen Holt had vanished from town, and Trevor Holt was under active investigation. But none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was the breeze carrying the smell of pine again. What mattered was the sound of crickets returning. What mattered was the stillness, not dead but alive with the possibility of healing. The lake wasn't perfect. Neither was I. But we were both still here, and we weren't going anywhere. The silence after the storm was almost louder than the storm itself. The HOA building remained dark, its glass doors taped shut with a printed notice from the county. Office closed, under investigation. That sign became a symbol. People took photos with it. Someone taped a plastic duck beneath it with a tiny cardboard protest sign that read, I want my pond back. The community was changing, shaken yes, but waking up. In the days following the governor's visit, official action came swift and sharp. Karen Holt was arrested and indicted on 4 felony counts: environmental negligence, misuse of community funds, fraudulent contracting, obstruction of state investigation. Her son, Trevor Holt, was apprehended in a gas station off I-95, reportedly trying to leave the state with $8,000 in cash and a flash drive full of encrypted files. He was charged with conspiracy, illegal dumping, and operating a business without a license. When the news broke, the neighborhood didn't rejoice. No champagne popped, no parties, just quiet. Like a long breath we'd all been holding finally exhaled. The EPA launched a full remediation plan within a week. They drained portions of the lake near the heaviest dump zones, carefully removing silt and contaminated debris. Massive filtration bags lined the banks like industrial cocoons, sucking out toxins and pumping in clean oxygen. Specialists planted aquatic vegetation, pickerel weed, water lilies, and bulrush to help restore the natural balance. Floating platforms were anchored in the deeper sections to support frog and turtle populations as they returned. The process was slow, deliberate, and absolutely beautiful. I helped where I could, mostly logging temperature readings, turbidity data, and photographing regrowth. It wasn't glamorous work, but it felt sacred. Marla Sanderson remained close, even after the threats had passed. She said she'd taken a liking to the place, and I often caught her at the lake at sunrise, sipping from a steel mug and watching the mist roll across the surface. Feels like it's breathing again, she said one morning, not looking at me. Like it knows it's safe. The HOA, now leaderless and disgraced, dissolved its original board. In its place, a Plumwish Community Restoration Committee formed volunteers this time. No elections, no power plays. Just residents who wanted to clean up what had been broken. I declined to lead it, but agreed to advise especially on environmental matters. David joined. So did Margie from Lot 27. Even Greg, the former board member who once threatened me with legal action, submitted a written apology and quietly asked to help clean up the park near the lake. Some people change, Marla said. Or they finally see clearly, I replied. Little by little, the neighborhood began healing too. Fences that had once divided yards came down. Kids played near the shallow end of the lake again, though signs still warned them to stay out of the water for now. Residents organized weekend potlucks. Ethan ran a lemonade stand with a sign that read, "Funds go to frog homes." He made 38 in one afternoon. I matched it. The biggest moment came in the form of a letter, thick envelope, official seal, from the State Office of Environmental Recognition. I opened it, carefully expecting another grant document or compliance update. Instead, I found a certificate. In honor of extraordinary civil environmental stewardship. This award is presented to Thomas Carson for unwavering courage, integrity, and the defense of public natural resources against unlawful destruction. Below it was a handwritten note from Governor Maxwell himself. Sometimes it takes just one voice to echo loud enough that the system finally listens. Yours was that voice. Thank you. I didn't frame it. I didn't hang it. I folded it, tucked it inside the notebook where I'd logged every test result, every drone image, every dead duck, and toxic sample. Because that wasn't the end of anything. It was just another page. On a quiet Thursday morning, I stepped onto my dock, same as I had 100 times before, but this time, the water was different. It was clear. Not perfect, not pristine, but clearer than I'd seen in months. Beneath the surface, sunlight reached the sandy bottom. Tiny schools of minnows darted between lily stems. A turtle surfaced, briefly blinked, then slipped away without a sound. And floating nearby, barely visible, was a cluster of frog spawn. Hundreds of translucent eggs like tiny orbs of glass. I sat down on the edge of the dock boots dangling over the side and let the stillness wrap around me. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel it. Relief, sorrow, victory, healing. Not just for the lake, for me. Later that day, a neighbor brought over a fresh blueberry pie. "You did it," she said simply. "You saved us." I smiled, shook my head. "No," I said. "We saved ourselves. I just refused to shut up." And for the first time in a long while, we laughed. Loud. Free. Like people who had finally remembered what it meant to live beside something sacred and to protect it with everything they had. The lake was never supposed to be a battlefield. It was just a piece of earth, a mirror of the sky. A quiet corner of the world meant for ducks, dragonflies, and those of us lucky enough to witness it each day. But it had become a crucible, one that revealed the best and worst of a community, the depths of greed and the endurance of truth. And now it was finally still again. Not dead, not dormant. Still like the breath you take after grief has passed, or the silence that follows a long-awaited answer. It was a morning in late spring when I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. I had risen early, long before the birds started their chatter, and walked barefoot onto the dock. The air was clean in a way I hadn't felt since before it all began. My lungs drew it in with reverence. The lake shimmered not with oily film or chemical residue, but with honest, open water. You could see through it again. The reeds had grown tall, swaying softly in the breeze. Clusters of lily pads dotted the far corner, their waxy leaves reaching toward the sky. And there, right at the edge, were ducklings. Not a hallucination, not a memory. Real live ducklings, trailing behind a mother whose feathers glistened with dew. I sat down slowly, as if afraid to break the spell. They paddled past without fear, and in that moment, I knew this place was coming back to life. That afternoon, Marla stopped by for the last time. She handed me a folded map and an envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "Final report," she said. "The lake's officially downgraded from hazardous to recovering." "You did it." I smiled. "We did it." She shrugged, handing me something else, a tin cup filled with fresh coffee. "You'll be on the cover of our next agency newsletter," she said. "Front page. The man who took on the HOA and won." "Catchy," I said. "Little long, though." She laughed. "You should be proud." I nodded, but said nothing. Pride was never the point. We drank our coffee in silence, both of us watching the water like sentries. She stood to leave after a while, and just before walking away, she turned. "Take care of yourself, Tom, and the lake." "I will," I said. "Always." The new HOA committee was just a shadow of what had come before. They didn't call themselves board members or executives, just neighbors. rotating volunteers. They met once a month beneath the big oak near the old playground. No closed doors, no secret budgets. They asked me to speak at the first meeting. I declined. Instead, I donated a bench. It sat beneath the willow tree near the eastern bend of the lake, where my wife's ashes had been spread. A bronze plaque was affixed to it. It didn't bear my name. It simply read, "For those who protect what cannot speak." Ethan, now officially the Junior Wildlife Ambassador, as his grandfather jokingly called him, spent his weekends tracking frog populations with a tiny notepad and a pair of binoculars. He gave me weekly updates with an enthusiasm I couldn't help but admire. 6 frogs this week, he told me one afternoon, holding up a chart he'd drawn with colored pencils. And 2 turtles. "You ever think about being a scientist?" I asked. He grinned. "Only if I can be like you." That one sentence did more for my soul than all the awards and news articles combined. I didn't return to the courtroom. I didn't press charges personally. The state took care of all that. Karen Holt was found guilty on 2 counts. Trevor Holt pled out, agreed to restitution and community service, including helping clean the very lake he tried to poison. Irony has a sense of humor, I guess. But I let go of anger. I had to. Holding on would have poisoned me the same way their waste tried to poison the lake. Instead, I spent my days planting, fixing, walking, writing, watching the sun rise and fall over the water, reading old letters from my wife under the willow tree, listening to the frogs at night, and knowing their voices meant something again. One morning, months later, a letter came. It was from a woman named Claire Reyes, living in a gated community 2 counties away. She'd seen the news reports followed the case, and now faced a similar battle. Her HOA had approved construction near a creek that fed directly into the neighborhood reservoir. She asked for advice, for hope, for proof that one voice mattered. I wrote back that night. I told her about the frog spawn, about the ducks, about the boy with binoculars and the turtle sightings and the neighbors who planted reeds where there used to be fences. I told her not to wait for permission to protect what she loved. And I ended with this: "You don't have to be loud. You just have to be steady. Even a whisper can change the current if it never stops." Years from now, I don't